Welcome to Bible Mind. We are going to continue our series, Eternity, that is going on for an eternity, but I'm having fun. Anybody else having fun with this? So, we could rehash the same old lessons, but, it's fun to dive deep into God's Word and to make it personal, and so I hope that you are getting plenty out of this. So we're going to be talking about Daniel 8 today. And we've already really talked about the first part of that. We talked about the ram and the goat. You remember that. So we're not going to rehash that. But we talked about the ram with the two horns that lives at the Harris's house. No, wait, that's a different ram altogether. The ram that Daniel saw was representative of the Medo-Persian Empire. And then the shaggy goat with the one long horn. The shaggy goat represented Greece, and the one long horn was Alexander the Great. And we're going to pick up with Daniel chapter 8, verse 8 today. The goat became very powerful, but at the height of his power, his large horn was broken off. In the large horn's place grew four prominent horns pointing in the four directions of the earth. So Alexander the Great was the long horn of the goat, and was suddenly broken off. And this is representative in 323 BC. Alexander just suddenly dies. He was 33 years old. And, there's only speculation, but some believe that it was just because of just the many battles, and he had received wounds here and there, and maybe some infection or something like that. He wasn't really killed by a wound, but maybe it was just the cumulative effect of all the battles, maybe some kind of sickness, who knows. But he dies. And his kingdom was divided among his four generals. And I'll say that generally, okay? Because if you study it in detail, there was a lot of infighting. There was a lot of infighting. There was a lot of outfighting. Anytime a leader doesn't have clear succession, everybody that has a strong personality wants to be the boss, right? And so there was a lot of this going on. Alexander did have an unborn child. One of his wives, Roxana, was 5 months pregnant, and so there was a child on the way. But who wants to wait till this baby's born and then grow up to be big enough to reign something when all of us able-minded, big ego people are here that we could take over right now? And so there was a lot of that. But anyway, the land was kind of divided up into four generals, and it was Antiochus, Cassander, Ptolemy, and Seleucus. Now, the main two that we'll talk about today is Ptolemy and Seleucus. Ptolemy took over what land is he kind of? Egypt, right? And Ptolemy is not. Ptolemy was a person that was in the beginning of all this dividing up, but his successors were also named what? Ptolemy. Okay, so there were a lot of Ptolemies. This is a bonus question. Who knows what Ptolemy's wife's name was?
Cassandra?
What'd you say?
Ptolemy.
Oh, no. Ptolemy. No.
He had a daughter named Cleopatra, right?
He had a wife named Cleopatra, and every Ptolemy's wife's name was Cleopatra. So it was kind of, but the last Cleopatra is the one that you're all, that comes to your mind, okay? And so anyway, so it was Ptolemy and Cleopatra. And then Seleucus, how many of you have ever heard of the Seleucid Empire? Seleucid, some people say Seleucid. Actual Greek, the C would be a hard sound, not a soft sound, but I do hear a lot of people on podcasts say Seleucid. So either way is acceptable in my sight. So, so control of Judea really bounced between Ptolemy, the Ptolemaic Empire, and the Seleucid Empire. And this is actually, we're not going to dive into a lot of Daniel 11. We will talk about it in the next couple of weeks as it relates to the Antichrist. But if you read Daniel 11, it's a little dizzying. Okay, because it talks about very detailed events that happen between the king of the north and the king of the south. The king of the north is the king of the Seleucid Empire, and the king of the south is the Ptolemaic Empire. And when you read Daniel 11, it almost reads like a history book that was prophesied. Some of the things, and we did a series on Daniel a while back, and we went to that and went through that in great detail on what that meant. We won't do that here today. But this is what Daniel 11 talks about, is that back and forth. So Judea was kind of like a ping pong ball or a tennis ball in a match between these two great, empires. It was really the Greek Empire. It was kind of weird because they all played by the same rules, but, it was almost like states, if you will. Okay, so, it was like Texas and Oklahoma and Missouri and Arkansas, and they all fought over things, territory and stuff like that, but they all considered themselves part of the Greek Empire. So even though control of the region swapped hands, Judaism was pretty much left alone. They were left to do their sacrifices and do their rituals and practice their religion for the most part. Greek influence found its way where some of the Jews, especially the higher class, maybe merchants, people like that of influence, that they would allow themselves to take on Greek culture, which is called what? Hellenization, right? Does anybody know where that comes from? Hellenization? Huh?
Rightfully Hellenes.
Okay. Hellas is actually did you know that Greece is not Greece? Even today, Greece is not Greece. Greece is an English word. Okay. The country was originally Hellas, and if we said it in Greek, it sound exactly like that. Okay, so sometimes we just think, well, if it's an English word, that's just what it is. Okay, so but the original people group and the original nation that became the Greek Empire was Hellas. Okay, and so as their influence spread, it was the Hellenization of the world. And so they learned Koine Greek, which Koine Greek is kind of like picture English. We all speak English, right? Have you ever encountered someone that spoke English and you had no idea what they said? Okay, yeah. It's easy to find a YouTube video on that. But different dialects say things differently and have different colloquialisms, right? Different expressions, stuff like that. Well, it's hard to have English and everybody speak English if English is even different. So Koine Greek was kind of a basic Greek. This is like the proper Greek that we're going to spread to everybody, and it was simpler than the Greek that the Greeks spoke, if you will. I'm really simplifying that, okay? So it's more complicated than that, but that's the simple part of it. So Koine Greek is the language that when Jesus came, that the Roman Empire spoke, and it's the language that the New Testament was written in. Greek names were also taken on even by the Jewish people. So, for example, if you had Joshua, his Greek name would be Jason. So you may have a Jason that's a Joshua, or you may have a Saul that's a Paul, if you will. Things like this. So they would have their Hebrew names, but they would also have their Greek names. All right. So verse 9 it says. By the way, anybody have your Bible today? I'd just encourage you, as some of you already have, just open it up to Daniel 8. Because everything pretty much today will be out of Daniel 8 except a few side notes that'll be on the screen. Verse 9 says, out of one of them, meaning out of one of the horns, came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. What's the glorious land? Israel, right. And so we had, out of these four empires, or these four kings, and these four areas, one of them, the horn that grew out of one of the other ones would mean descendant, right? So not necessarily blood descendant, but of that empire, so succession. So this little horn comes up out of this one particular empire, and since it says its influence, it became great to the south, to the east, and to the west, which is Judea, from where it was, that would make it the king of the north, right? So it's talking about the Seleucid Empire. And Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, came to the throne of the Seleucids in 175 BC. And we can identify this horn as Antiochus IV Epiphanes as being this horn just because of the way history unfolds and matches up to what Daniel said about him. But Epiphanes means manifest or the glorious, illustrious. Okay, so he was implying that he was godlike, that he was divine. He's there in power because the gods have allowed it, and so he's the manifestation of God. Now, secretly, some people called him Antiochus Epiphanes, which meant the madman. And so they didn't have, it was kind of a, what do you call that? A pun, or if you will, or whatever. So he would call himself this, and they would say, oh, no, he's the mad. He appears to have done really little at first to antagonize the Jews. Just kind of left them alone at first. And the Jews were largely content to live under his rule. Daniel 8, verse 10, it says, "It," meaning the little horn, "grew great, even to the host of heaven, and some of the host and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. It became great, even as great as the prince of the host. And the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown. And a host will be given over to it together with the regular burnt offering because of transgression, and it will throw truth to the ground, and it will act and prosper. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, For how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary and host to be trampled underfoot? And he said to me, For 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state." So these events seem to describe events that are happening both. If you just look at the read of that, you see a physical battle that's taking place. You see physical things that are taking place, but you kind of see a crossover between the spiritual, right? And we talked about this last week. I want to read it again in Ephesians 6:12. "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against" what? "Against rulers and against authorities and principalities, cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places." And so we see that even when there's struggles on earth, there's a struggle in the spiritual realm that often coincides with that, things that are going on in the spiritual. The Hebrew in verse 12 of Daniel 8, though, it's really tough to interpret. Sometimes, and you'll see this in some of the Old Testament texts, when you see the biggest variance between different translations of the Bible, usually it's because the Hebrew is not really clear, and so they're trying to get from context, okay, what is meant here. And so you'll see this a few different ways. So let's look at it in the New King James Version. It says, "Because of transgression, an army was given over to the horn to oppose the daily sacrifices, and he cast truth down to the ground. He did all this and prospered." The New International Version says, "Because of rebellion, the Lord's people in the daily sacrifice were given over to it, and it prospered in everything it did, and truth was thrown to the ground." And so maybe having these other treatments maybe gives us a more rounded picture of what's going on. So things started to escalate and change when the priest was Onias III at the time. He was the high priest in Jerusalem. And he had a brother named Jason, maybe Joshua, but Jason was his Greek name. And he wanted to be the high priest, and so he gave Antiochus a large sum of money, a bribe, if you will, right? Sometimes money talks, right? And so Antiochus took this bribe, and he deposed Onias III as high priest and installed Jason as priest. Now, Jason, as you can tell by his name, maybe he's a little more Hellenized than Onias III was, right? And so Jason does a little bit to kind of taint the temple and the things that are going on there. He actually, in the courts, allowed some other idols to be brought in just to kind of, make nice with the Greek people, if you will. Well, then you have another brother, a third brother. His name was Menelaus. Menelaus gave Antiochus an even bigger bribe than Jason did. And so guess what happened? Now Jason's out and Menelaus is in. Okay? And so Menelaus didn't really have the money for that bribe. Apparently he had borrowed it or something. So he started selling off things in the temple to pay off his bribe. So things are getting a little shaky around in Judea, right? And so that happened in 172. There was Onias the third, the first brother that was the high priest. He rebuked Menelaus over this, and so Menelaus had him killed. In 170 BC, Menelaus allowed Antiochus, as he was going to one of his campaigns. There was a lot of back and forth with Ptolemy at the time, and so there was a lot of fighting. He was going down to Egypt, and so Menelaus let Antiochus come into the temple and raid the treasury and take whatever he needed for his campaign. And so this also defiled the temple, allowing the Greek people to come into the temple during this time. And then 168 BC, Antiochus goes down to fight a war with the Ptolemy or the Egyptians, and Jason had heard that Antiochus had been killed. And so he said, this is my chance. So he led a rebellion against Menelaus. He was going to take over the priesthood by force. And Antiochus, who was very much not dead, heard about this uprising, and he sees it as a personal affront to himself because he had installed Menelaus as priest. So he sends the army to Judea, and they come in, and things spiraled out of control pretty quickly. About 100,000 Jews were killed that day. The temple was broken into. The altar, everything was broken down. They declared it a temple to Zeus. They set up a statue to Zeus. On the altar of God where sacrifices were sacrificed, they sacrificed a pig. If you know what that means to Judaism, right? They took the broth or the juices from the pig and they went into the temple and they just sprinkled pig juice on everything in the temple, including the Torah, the scrolls of the Torah that were in there. Completely desecrated. So when you hear abomination of desecration, this is one reference, and we're going to talk about that more later, even over the couple of weeks. And so this was a horrific thing that happened. Sacrifice had to stop, right? And you read that in the text of Daniel, that sacrifice would stop. The sacrifice stopped because the temple was desecrated. It was not pure. It was unclean. As a matter of fact, they went beyond just the temple, but they started making the Jewish people eat pork. So they had a big barbecue and they made some pulled pork sandwiches. And they said, all right, you Jews, line up for some pulled pork. And making light of it, but it was serious to them, right? They stopped circumcision and they made them start working on the Sabbath. Almost everything that the Jewish people were against, they made them do. So they completely crushed and destroyed the sacrifices and the things that the Jewish people worshipped and lived and their customs. All that was at an end. So we go back up to our scripture, and Daniel overhears these two holy figures. One of them asks the other one, how long is this going to go on? How long is the sacrifice going to be stopped? And the other one said this. It said, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state. Now, how many of you heard about the 2,300 days before? Okay, a couple of 2 or 3 nods. This has been a springboard throughout time for a lot of, date makers, to try to calculate when Jesus is coming back. And so in the early 1800s, there was a man named William Miller that he took this 2,300 days as being 2,300 years, and he calculated from when Cyrus declared that the temple could be rebuilt. He added 2,300 years to that, and he come up with 1844. Jesus is coming back in 1844. And so everybody believed him. And he was very convincing. He had all the facts and he had all the figures, and he had, this is one of his pages, and he had all this stuff figured out, right? He's got to be right. It's too detailed. And so everybody buys in. I say buys in, they sold off. That's what they did. They sold houses, they sold their businesses, they got rid of all their stuff, and a lot of them just went and hung out on the hillside waiting for Jesus to come back.
Is he in America?
He was in America, yes. And so guess what? Jesus didn't come back in 1844.
They were homeless.
And they were homeless and businessless and foodless and a lot of things. And this day in history, or this event in history, is looked back on with the name the Great Disappointment. A lot of people were disillusioned in Christianity because he had it figured out and it didn't happen. And so we have to be careful, right, with predictions, with any of these prophecies that we try to put a date. Because Jesus said, and we've talked about this already, nobody knows the date. So don't even try. If you give me a date, I already know that's not when he's coming. So, because you think it's that day. But nobody knows the day or the hour. So, from that movement, but though from William Miller's movement, several other movements arose. Does anybody want to take a stab at what some of those are?
Seventh-day Adventists, right?
Seventh-day Adventists come out of that. One more prominent one, Jehovah's Witness, also came out of that movement. And so we see from this, false narrative, you see some things that have some lingering effects even to this day. Let's go back to the 2,300 days and look at a couple of extra versions. The NIV, it says, he said to me, it will take 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary will be cleansed or reconsecrated. And he said to me, this New King James Version, he said to me, for 2,300 days, then the sanctuary shall be cleansed. Okay, so the reason we know that you can't put 2,300 years in this case, and I know we've talked about some other things where we said, okay, this means years. Next week we're going to talk about a case where days means years. But we know this case doesn't mean years because it says 2,300 evenings and mornings or days. Well, we'll break that down in a second. Until when?
The sanctuary.
The sanctuary is restored and cleansed and reconsecrated, right? And we know that in John 22, it was John 10:22. It says, it was now winter, and Jesus was in Jerusalem at the time of Hanukkah, the festival of dedication. The festival of dedication is not one of the Mosaic festivals. That's a festival that came along later, and we'll talk about what that means. But it was a festival that denotes the cleansing of the temple. So Jesus was in the temple, and the temple was cleansed. So we know those 2,300 days have already passed somewhere, right? The 2,300, whatever you want to call them, have already passed because Jesus is in the temple and the festival of dedication, or the feast of dedication. So what is this feast of dedication then? Today it's called Hanukkah, and so it denotes a a pushback against all the things that we just talked about, the desecration of the temple and all the things that happened. During that time, a revolution started to spring up, grassroots revolution, led by a family known as the what?
Maccabees.
The Maccabees, right? And so the Maccabees, first it was the father, and he had 5 sons, and the father passed away, and Judas Maccabeus was the one that kind of took up the cause, if you will, and led a revolt against Antiochus and his armies. And I won't have time to go into all that. It's quite fascinating to see how that war. They started with just like 600 people, and they routed this large army with just 600 people, kind of guerrilla warfare kind of stuff, and defeated them and pushed them back. And so then more people joined the cause. Well, they sent more people. Well, they had more people. And so they just kept winning and kept winning. On December 25th, 164 BC, this is why Hanukkah is at the same time as Christmas, because on this date, they finally won the final battle at the garrison at Jerusalem. They went into the temple. They tore down the statue of Zeus. They consecrated, they cleaned the temple. They went through and they purged everything, and they made the temple available for sacrifice again. And so they celebrate this day. When they went into the temple, how many of you know the candlestick, right? The menorah, call it today, but it was 7, right? So there was a middle one, and there was 3 branches on the side from Mosaic time. What was the rule about the candle in the temple? It was never supposed to go out. They go into the temple, of course it's out, right? And so they wanted to get the candle lit again. And so they looked, and everything had been plundered. But they found enough oil. It was still in a container that was sealed by the priest, so they knew it had been untouched. They had enough oil for one day. The complication is that it's an 8-day process to make oil that's suitable for the candlestick or the lamps in the temple. And it couldn't go out. They have a dilemma. So they take the oil and they light the candlestick with what they have, and they started making more. The candle stayed lit for 8 days until they had enough oil to start putting back in the candlestick again. And that's why you see the menorah during Hanukkah as having, you say 9, but it's really, there's 1 candle for each of the 8 days. This one right here, the reason it's out of sort, that's the one they take and they light 1 candle a day for 8 days, because it's an 8-day festival, and they light one of these a day for the 8 days that it took to restore and to bring the light back. So now you learned something today, correct? Okay, so the timing on this, all of this happened a little over 3 years after the desolating sacrifice started. And so I did this little chart for you here, try to get out of your way. But we have Antiochus comes to power, comes to the throne, and then in 72 is when Menelaus bribes Jason and becomes priest. And so here in 170 is where Antiochus comes in and plunders the temple, starts the defiling of the temple. And you have in 167, that's when the desecration of the temple and the halting of the sacrifice took place. And then you had the cleansing of the temple by Judas Maccabeus. From here to here, we know this exact date, but we don't know this exact date, is about 2,300 days. Okay? Now, the reason I have this divided up, 2,300 days, by the way, is about 6.4 years. The reason I have this divided up into these two here is some people, because the Hebrew reads 2,300 evenings and mornings, they take that to mean, okay, that means 1150 evenings and 1150 mornings to make 2,300 evenings and mornings. You see what I'm saying? So even if they're right, it's still a fulfillment of the prophecy, because you have 1150 and 1150. Around the same time that this happened, Antiochus he sent his troops to do all the stuff, but he was off, fighting wars, right? Antiochus fell dead, not by a sword, but just died. And so the Jews looked at that as, hey, it's by divine judgment that Antiochus was killed. Let's go on down to verse 15 now. When I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it. You ever been there? You ever had a vision, you wake up and you sought to understand it? Right? I have. And behold, there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Uli, and it called, Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was frightened, and I fell on my face. But he said to me, understand, O son of man, that the vision is for the time, when? Of the end. Okay. So in great detail, I showed you the fulfillment of Daniel's vision, right? I mean, so detailed of a fulfillment that you can't say that it wasn't a fulfillment. But yet, Gabriel says, but you have to understand, this vision is for the time of the end. And just like we've talked about already, that prophecies in the Bible often have dual fulfillment. We say it this way. We say history repeats itself, right? And so God gave Daniel a vision that, yes, it was fulfilled in 164 BC and around that time. But Gabriel said it's also for the time of the end. So we can see a parallel in the story, that the narrative that we just went through great pains to go through. We can see a parallel in that and the things that are going to happen at the end. In Jesus' time, the Jewish people understood the historic fulfillment of Daniel and celebrated each year with the Feast of Dedication. They knew what the fulfillment of that was. They knew when Daniel had that vision, they said, okay, we're celebrating this. We tell the story every year. Jesus knew that as a good Jewish man himself. Yet Jesus takes the common Jewish understanding of Daniel and he takes it a whole new direction. In Matthew 24:15, which this is in the middle of his Olivet Discourse, you get 2 gold stars. He says in verse 15, so when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Okay, so this in parentheses, this is Matthew writing this, right? And so he's giving you what Jesus said, and then he inserts, if you're reading this, you need to understand what this means. Okay? And so that's why it's important that we just went through all of this, because who's the reader today? We are, right? So let the reader understand. When you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, we just described how that was fulfilled in prophecy. And so Matthew is saying, understand the context that this is coming from when Jesus said that. It says, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. And so Jesus is talking in future tense. Jesus isn't saying, hey, remember when all this happened? He said, when you see it, when you see it, then here's what you need to know about it. And so Jesus is telling us that, yes, we all know how this was fulfilled, but there's going to come a time when you're going to see it. And there's going to be a time when you need to react to the things that are taking place. Daniel 11, which we haven't been in chapter 11 today, verse 31, it says that it forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and fortress, and shall take away the regular burnt offering, and they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. And so this is the exact verse that Jesus is referring back to. Daniel 11 is another vision with just stunning, like I said earlier, stunning detail about what happens during this time. And there's some more detail even in what we're going to pull out next week when we're talking about the 70 weeks. But Jesus does not deny that Daniel 11:31 refers to Antiochus. Rather, for Jesus, Antiochus is merely like a foreshadowing. He's a type of the Antichrist that is to come at the end of time. And he's going to be the greatest enemy that God's people has ever had, and it's coming at the end of time. Back to Daniel 8, verse 23. And at the latter end of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their limit, a king of bold face, one who understands riddles, shall arise. His power shall be great, but not by his own power. And he shall cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in what he does, and destroy mighty men with the people who are the saints. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand, and in his own mind he shall become great. Without warning he shall destroy many, and he shall even rise up against the prince of princes, and he shall be broken, but not by a human hand. And so we see a lot of this kind of in the story of Antiochus, but there's certain parts of it that doesn't fit exactly. And so these, you might say, all those times of dual fulfillment of prophecy, the near fulfillment is not perfect, is an imperfect fulfillment. The future fulfillment is the perfect fulfillment. So in Daniel 8, we see an Antiochus as an imperfect fulfillment, but we'll see in Antichrist as the perfect fulfillment of this prophecy. So let's break down and look at just a few of these things. When it says, when the transgressors have reached their limit. How many of you know God has a limit? In Noah's time, he had a limit, didn't he? It's like, you've reached the limit. You got to do something. Sodom was destroyed because God had reached his limit. Daniel's seeing these visions while he's in captivity because God had reached his limit with his chosen people that were obedient with him. And so, again, at the end of time, there's going to be a time that God reaches his limit with mankind, and these things will take place. 2 Thessalonians 2:3 says, for that day will not come unless the rebellion comes first. Peter said that God is patient, and that his will is for all to come to repentance. That's what God wants. But there comes a time when God reaches his limit of transgression, and his action will be swift. Then we go on down, it says, a king of bold face, one who understands riddles, shall arise. His power shall be great, but not by his own power. And he shall cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in whatever he does, and destroy mighty men and peoples who are the saints. And so there's a lot of stuff that's going on here. And Antiochus Epiphanes was known for his cruel brutality. I mean, he was a vicious, cruel person. This is also going to be true of the Antichrist. Antiochus was known for his flattery and his smooth tongue. He would maybe work out a peace treaty with you or something, and then at moment's notice, when your guard is down, he'll take over. And this is what Antichrist is going to do. We'll see as we talk about these times that he works out a peace treaty with the people on earth and with the people of Israel, and they'll be able to rebuild their temple. And then he switches, and in the end, he unleashes his cruelty. 2 Thessalonians 2:9, it says, the coming of the lawless one is by the activity of Satan with all power and false signs and wonders. And so even Paul is looking on the Antichrist as being something that we see pictured out in Antiochus. Both the rule of Antiochus in the past and Antichrist in the future are marked by deceit. 2 Thessalonians 2:10 says, and with all wicked deception for those who are perishing, because they refuse to love the truth and so be saved. And so, of course, we've already established in the past quite thoroughly that the saints that are referred to here is the Jewish people in the end times that's being dealt with. Then we go on down, it says, by his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand, and in his own mind he shall become great. The coins that Antiochus Epiphanes had printed in his name, it had this inscribed on it, Theos Epiphanes. That means God manifest, and has his picture on it. He thought a lot of himself, didn't he? And so likewise will the Antichrist will exalt himself. In 2 Thessalonians 2:4 it says, who opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. And then we go on down, it says, and he shall even rise up against the prince of princes. Antiochus in the natural fought against the Jewish people, but in the spiritual, he battled against God himself, right? So God allowed things to happen as part of God's master plan. The Antichrist will be so full of himself that he'll muster the forces of earth, and he will come up out in battle against the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, the second coming of Christ as Jesus comes down. That's not going to work out too well for him, is it? And it goes on to say, and he shall be broken, but by no human hand. History tells us that Antiochus died of disease. He just fell dead, and nobody conquered or killed him. And this was viewed as the judgment of God. In similar way, no man will defeat the coming Antichrist, but the hand of Jesus will strike him down. In 2 Thessalonians 2:8 it says, whom the Lord Jesus will kill with the breath of his mouth and bring to nothing by the appearance of his coming. And so Jesus is just gonna come, and it says the breath of his mouth. What is the imagery we're given in Revelation that's coming out of Jesus' mouth? A sword, right? A flaming sword. It's all symbolic of Jesus' word, right? And so this just means by Jesus' word, Jesus is just going to speak the word, and Antichrist will be defeated. In Revelation 19, verse 19 and through 21, it says, and I saw the beast and the kings of the earth with their armies gathered to make war against him who was sitting on the horse and against his army. And the beast was captured, and with it the false prophet, who in its presence had done the signs by which he deceived those who had received the mark of the beast and those who worshipped its image. These two were thrown alive into the lake of fire that burns with sulfur, and the rest were slain by the sword that came from the mouth of him who was sitting on the horse. Daniel 8:27, we'll wrap up with this. It says, and I, Daniel, was overcome and lay sick for some days. It's quite a disturbing vision that he had and conversation, and it was very troubling, and he took all this on, and he just lay sick for several days. It says, then I arose and went about the king's business, and I was appalled by the vision, and I did not understand it. The thing I want to leave you with today, I think most of us have a sense in our heart that the time is growing toward the end, right? And there's several reactions that we can have to it. We can look at the condition of the world. We can look at the things that are coming to pass, and we can let it make us sick, and we can let it make us shut down, and we can just check out of life, right? But I think what we need to do is take Daniel's advice. He said, I arose and I went about the king's business. Today we need to go about the king's business more than ever before. And maybe in prayer this week, take some self-reflection time and just look at the things that occupy your time and occupy your life, and ask yourself the question, am I about the king's business? And I know we have to make a living, and we have to clean our house, and we have to mow our grass. But at the end of the day, how much are we about the king's business? So I want to challenge you today to be about his business, because the time is coming to an end.